I've been assigned today to talk about the Article 32, and here it is in all its glory. I'm going to have, it's basically speak in two parts. I'm going to speak about Article 32 and the background of Article 32, and then I'm going to speak about the perspective from someone who does international health and development. So I'm not a lawyer. And I approach it from a very different perspective. And I see both the strengths and some of the weaknesses of trying to carry out Article 32. Let me just, I meant to highlight this, but let me just go over it briefly. The issue for Article 32 is that it's a statement that says states parties recognize the importance of international cooperation and its promotion. And it looks particularly at international and regional organizations and civil society, in particular organizations of persons with disabilities, although not exclusively DPOs. And then it has four kind of sub-themes: ensuring the international cooperation, including international development programs, are inclusive and accessible, facilitating and supporting capacity building, including the exchange and sharing of information, experiences, training programs, and best practices, facilitating cooperation in research and access to scientific and technical knowledge, and providing as appropriate technical, economic assistance, including facilitating access to and sharing of accessible and assistive technologies. That covers a very wide scope. Let me talk a bit about the background. And it's also a very unique article in many ways within this or any other convention. The article is founded on with the knowledge that people with disabilities are among the most marginalized and poorest of all poor people, and that most international development activities do not reach people with disabilities. It's estimated that 80% of persons with disabilities live in developing countries, but only 3 to 4% of them are estimated to benefit from development efforts. By the way, this, as in many other things where we have statistics on disability, is best guess at best. It's not, I don't know where the 3 to 4% comes from, so I would say it is widely quoted, but don't quote it from me, because again, a lot of these figures, it's like 2 out of every 5 of the poorest people on earth are disabled is a guess, it's not a statistic. That lands us in hot water when we're talking to people outside of the legal field, when we have to talk to development or health people. For a number of reasons that I'll go into right now, it was felt that there was an urgent need for an inclusion of a specific article on international cooperation in the CRPD itself, and this is the article. In many ways, even when the convention was being written, this article was a center of a good deal of controversy. Some state partners, especially the northern states, were afraid of great financial consequences. Some UN agencies were not too happy either. If you notice, I won't go back, but if you look at the article, it's kind of vague. It says we will help with all sorts of technical assistance, we will become involved in and support disabled people's organizations. There's no specificity there. So they're talking about a right, but if you're talking about development, you're also talking about an obligation to fund and to support. And that made a lot of states parties very nervous because there's no end to the amount of support that you could give. Traditionally, UN conventions only make brief reference to international cooperation concepts, and these are usually not linked to unqualified specific technological and economic assistance. So even putting it in was a kind of stab in the dark, but I think it was felt at the time, as I recall the discussions, it was felt that something had to be in there. And the reason it was felt that something on international cooperation had to be in there was because disability is a major cross-cutting development issue for all development partners, although it is rarely addressed in development efforts, because international cooperation, which is not inclusive of disability issues, potentially can lead to the creation of long-term barriers for people with disabilities. We've recently written a paper, which I actually can send and put up on the website, where we're talking about a disability and development gap So, and I think it's growing. So if no child in the village goes to school, then the disabled child who's not in school is not at a particular disadvantage. Once every other child in the village goes to school, that disabled child is now both educationally and also socially often marginalized in a way they are not before development comes in. So development must be addressed. And also, I believe that the Article 32 was put in because it was felt it was a unique opportunity that would not come again. Who supported the article when it came up for a vote? All the government delegations with extensive development aid programs such as the EU and countries like the US, NGOs, and DPOs. So it had broad support. By the way, I'm putting pictures in just because nobody's putting pictures in, so I can wake you up. Under Article 32, there's a number of obligations. It calls for international cooperation, including international development programs, to be inclusive of and accessible to persons with disabilities. What do we mean by international cooperation? Well, broadly, we're talking about aid programs, exchange and sharing of information experiences, training programs, and I think that should be best practices. It could be, although it's not currently used, also nearly enough to talk about educational exchanges, ensuring the training of students with disabilities and training on disabilities for people going into all the professions. The obligation also is anything that enhances implementation. So sharing information, practices for reference, scientific research, education, cooperation between states, international organizations and civil societies, in particular the DPOs, and the development of technology. That's a lot of development. And it's made all the more striking by the fact that not only does this cut a very wide swath, but we haven't informed development agencies about this yet. So it sounds good on paper, but in fact, and I'll come back to this in a bit, those obligated to respond and collaborate, in fact, many of them don't know that the convention exists, have not been part of the dialogue, and really haven't thought through how their policies go, other than perhaps the stray, small, specifically targeted project or program will reach people with disabilities. So who is obligated? Well, everybody, states, parties, regional groups like the EU, specialized agencies like the World Health Organization and the and UNICEF, financial institutions, including the World Bank, and actors in the North and South. And it has implications for all work. So for example, the Millennium Development Goals should be, when the convention came in, it was passed and then ratified 2006, 2008. We needed to go back and look at all the Millennium Development Goals and to see how those are affected by something like the convention. Where is disability mentioned in any of the Millennium Development Goals? Well, it's not. That boat had sailed. By the time we started to look in 2002 at the UN at putting together a UN convention, we're already 2 years into the Millennium Development Goals. We're now having another conversation on the MDGs and what it will look like in the post-2015 agenda. But in fact, and I'll come back to this again, currently there's nothing on disability in most of the major instruments that are driving the international development agenda. And the MDGs top the list. What are states parties obliged to do or obligated to do under the Article 32? Well, they're supposed to establish and presumably maintain relations between all actors, link all fields related to disabilities in a multilateral and decentralized cooperation, and around things like poverty alleviation, health, education, civic involvement, and also cooperation through technical and/or economic assistance. It's also linked to Article 31. And again, the states are to collect data and statistics to disseminate data, and this has very applied implications for Article 32. Briefly, unless you know where you are, you don't know where you're going. And so if we don't have statistics now, figuring out whether any progress has been made is very difficult to do. And we talk about statistics or monitoring or evaluating, but when it comes right down to it, unless you have the numbers, how many people are affected, how many programs, has there been an improvement over time in people's incomes or levels of education? So baseline and some progress being made on the baseline, just saying how many people are affected or how many people with disabilities live in poverty doesn't tell you much. If you say 40% of all people in country X who are disabled make less than $1.25 a day, that's important, but you also need to know whether 40% of non-disabled people make the same amount, or whether people who are disabled are, well actually there are only 3 answers to much of the research that can be done. People with disabilities are either worse off, the same as, or better than people who are non-disabled in the same category. And so all these talk about monitoring and evaluation in terms of the development component, we need to think of in terms of not just figuring out where we're going, but where we are now and building on that. This is not entirely new. There was a call for a statistics bureau on disability that went in and was passed around at a meeting in 1932 that the League of Nations ran. It was a proposal that was put in by what's today the New York-based organization Rehabilitation International. So we've known this was coming for a while, but again, we still have very little in the back in terms of actual information on which to build. Finally, and then I'll get back to the development perspective on this. The very last line of Article 32 says, "The provisions of this article are without prejudice to the obligations of each state party to fulfill its obligation under the present convention. This means to me, at least as a lawyer, as a non-lawyer, that if states don't meet this article or do not implement it in a timely way, none of the rest of the convention is to be held up." So in a sense, you can do the rest of the convention without doing anything about international development, and it should still move ahead. In a sense, then, the Article 32 is aspirational. Where would we like to go as opposed to where we are now? Well, what does this look like on the ground? So this all looks very impressive, but what does it look like on the ground? Well, there's a distinction, a fundamental distinction between a rights perspective and a development perspective to begin with, and we really haven't had much of a conversation about this. A rights perspective, as lawyers or as people approaching a rights issue, you will say, it doesn't matter if it's one person or 1,000 or 10,000 people, their right to, for example, get to a voting booth and vote is the same. And so we want every voting booth in this country to be disability accessible, even if only one person votes. That's not paraphrased. That fair enough for a rights perspective? From a development perspective, development people, people who are working in international development are coming from both economics and in terms of health, they're coming from epidemiology as a background. And they're thinking greatest good for the greatest number. So they're not going to, if I said, I want everything to stop and for you to put in place accessible voting booths for that one person somewhere in the country who might want to vote, the response I would get from most development people is to say, well, we appreciate that, it's a nice thought, but how about can't we put in a ramp to a health clinic instead, or a ramp to schools where we know we'll get more people? We know that 10,000 children will be affected, not just that one. And so the numbers are not only important, but they set priorities. And it can be very complex. I was going to give an example of a couple of weeks ago, we wrapped up a big study in Nepal where we were looking at disabled women's access to maternal health services. We found that we surveyed almost 14,000 women, of whom 28%, or about almost 4,000, were disabled. But of those women with disabilities, it was the women with more severe disabilities, which was only a much smaller number, only several hundred, who really needed intense support and services. So what do I tell the local Minister of Health in the Makhampur district in Nepal? I can say, and I did say last week at a meeting, you need to educate all your health workers on how to treat women with disabilities with respect and dignity, and here are their rights. But when when it came to where do we put the most funding, it would be in an outreach effort for women with the more severe disabilities to teach them how to take care of neonates immediately after birth. So it's both, my suggestion was not just a rights-based suggestion, I could broadly say rights, but when it came right down to it, in terms of priority, they have a limited budget and a limited amount of time and attention they're going to pay to this information. So if I'm thinking of Article 32 and I'm thinking what I say as a medical anthropologist, I'm not really taking a rights approach. I wish I could. It's a luxury in some ways that I can't afford or I'm going to lose the dialogue. So, and that comes to, it plays out in things like the Millennium Development Goals. Do you do the greatest good for the greatest number? Do you talk about rights? Well, I'm not going to decide this, but I do want to bring it to your attention. It's not as easy as just saying rights when it comes from the bottom up. Also, when it comes to work underway, there's a lot of work underway in many of the countries I work in, where the national ratification of the CRPD has been an important step forward. I'm talking in the last 6 months, for example. I've done work in like Tanzania and Zambia and Uganda and a couple of other countries. The CRPD is very important. And the CRPD has engendered national policies that also look great on paper. And in some cases, for example, Tanzania just did an excellent national census. So for the first time, instead of guessing how many disabled people there are, we know now on the village level in Tanzania how many people with disabilities there are. Best practices have lagged behind. But suddenly we're getting, it's fashionable to say we don't have data, but in fact, from a development perspective, we are starting to get data. We're starting to fill in at least pieces of the puzzle. But data and numbers alone don't drive policy. And neither does law. I'll say this now I'm terrible with PowerPoint, so I might come back in PowerPoint and say it in a bit. But it's also very important to realize that there's kind of a top-down and a bottom-up approach to all of this. So, Tanzania is a good example. They have a very good, they've done a lot with awareness. A lot of the ministers now know about the issues involved. There's a strong civil society and very strong DPO movement that has started to move forward. So people who are in on the dialogue are in on the dialogue about the convention. But you go to any NGO, a large NGO like Save the Children or Oxfam, and you ask them about disabilities, and they'll say, oh, well, we did have one special program for disabilities about 3 years ago, once for a group of disabled children, or a large NGO that will go nameless will talk about, they certainly supported disabled children, and they actually got 3 wheelchairs just last year for all the children in Tanzania. I think 3 wheelchairs doesn't do it. In terms of just the numbers involved, knowing that these things are on the books was not translating down in a meaningful way. And when it does translate down, when you go to people who know about these things, you go to a minister of health or a minister of education, something you say, the convention says this, but I notice that none of the children in this district are currently in school, its law is clearly on the book. Often, his or her response is, yeah, we know, what are you going to do about it? So just having the laws on the books do not generate the action that we sometimes think it does. You can't, in countries
where in many countries you can't just sue and get your rights. And in fact, and I said this earlier in a comment, if you're an individual with a disability in a small village or in a rural slum, where do you start? How do you even move up that chain? Again, I have more questions than answers with this, but I think we should be asking these questions. We're so, we've made great progress with the CRPD, but until the CRPD starts playing out on the ground with people that really need the support, then we've not fully implemented the convention. I don't know if we'll ever fully implement the convention, but we need to be perhaps asking tougher questions. I'll give Janet to give the example of AIDS. It's a good example. I've worked some on the issue of the impact of the AIDS epidemic on people with pre-existing disabilities. People with disabilities are at a significantly increased risk of becoming HIV positive. They're as sexually active as any other group. They're more likely to be sexually abused. They're less likely to get information about how to protect themselves from becoming infected. And once infected, they are less likely than other people to be able to get the care, support, and resources that they need and often are entitled to by law in order to make sure that they stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible. Nonetheless, getting the attention of the global AIDS community, which should be because they're under the sway of the Millennium Development Goals, they should be bound also by the convention, and they're simply not. Actually, Janet and Steve Esty also has been part of a campaign we've been having for about 3, 4, 5 years now, where we're continually pestering, and I mean calling and showing up at the doorstep, UN AIDS, and we even got finally a statement out of Michelle Sidibe, head of UN AIDS, about how they needed to pay more attention to persons with disabilities. Nonetheless, there's nothing that we've been able to do to get the global AIDS mechanism to be more responsive to people with disabilities. That's a tragedy and a lost opportunity, and the convention should be a mechanism that allows us to pull a lever and get people's attention. It does to some extent, but not nearly enough. So the issue is and my question to all the smart lawyers and policy people in the room is, what mechanisms are we missing such that we can have Article 32 in the convention? We have 132 countries signing on to the convention, and yet we're not being able to actually move things in most countries where the convention has been ratified. Okay. Also, in terms of legal efficacy, by the way, I don't mean to make you. It sounds like I'm complaining about the convention. I'm not at all. But I do want to say that coming from outside, I see its limitations as well as its strengths. And so they invited me here to say a few things about development. So I'm just going to bring up some of the other issues that kind of bother me on a regular basis. One is that we think this is the only legal system we have when we're talking about national legal systems. There are also traditional legal systems, local legal systems. Often they're not linked into the national legal systems. And we need to have a dialogue with many of the traditional legal systems as well, how people run their families or communities, and have the convention also translated into a format where people who are under, say, traditional or tribal legal systems think through what the convention means to them. We keep talking about stigma and prejudice. There's a lot of stigma and prejudice out there, but I often see, I certainly encounter a lot of stigma and prejudice, but I also see in a lot of cases, people just don't know what to do. I think it's more ignorance often than stigma and prejudice. So you sit down with a local tribal leader in some of the places I've worked, and you explain what the convention is and what we'd like to do with disabled people. They'll often say, oh, my grandson has just this problem. I've often wondered what to do as well. So I think that again, while stigma and prejudice are important, it's equally important to realize that we sometimes miss teaching opportunities, and that for people who just don't know or don't know where to start, or often have never thought about disability in anything other than a medical context. So, and I think the convention is an extremely powerful tool to frame this kind of dialogue. But we have to start off with the idea that most people have not heard of the convention. Even most disabled people in the world have not heard of the convention. I just finished a study for Barbara Murray and the ILO, the International Labor Organization. We went out and I did a study of disabled beggars in Ethiopia. And I went and surveyed a whole bunch of people who work by begging, who are disabled and live on the streets or in the slums of Addis. And I asked how many of them had ever heard of the convention. Less than 7% had ever heard of the convention, and that was only because it had recently been on the local radio. And only 3% had had any contact with any of the local DPOs. So we're assuming that our efforts at this level are reaching people with disabilities at the ground level, and it's sadly often not the case. Okay. Also, in terms of need and priority, there are different levels that we need to be thinking about when it comes to the convention. Government is one, and as I said, you can have people. In my experience, a lot of people who are working in ministries and other places are very smart, very dedicated people, but that doesn't mean that the work moves beyond the ministries. You have local government officials who often are not approached, or we think that the ministries will tell them about the convention. In fact, I think that's maybe something where we can effectively go in and get people's attention at the local government level, and I've already spoken about traditional practices. By the way, when we're talking about traditional practices and beliefs, it's not, we often say we have to fix things, but we really need to think, and this is true for disability worldwide, it's often complex and nuanced. So, for example, I put Ecuador down there, so I'll tell you a story about Ecuador. I did a study not that long ago. Well, actually, it's now 3 or 4 years ago. But I went in with a student of mine. We were going to look at childhood immunization rates in a part of Ecuador. And my theory was that disabled children would be much less likely to be immunized than their non-disabled siblings. Turns out that they had exactly the same rate of immunization. And the reason was because the local belief was that disabled people were just like everybody else. And so they didn't have a prejudice towards disability that we had assumed would exist. So we need to look at traditional beliefs about disability, because sometimes they're there to be, sometimes they're not prejudicial, and we can build on them as opposed to assuming that we know better. Again, because we're building on them and we're building towards things that can link in with the convention, then I think that's very important. And it's another lesson we're learning coming from a development perspective. Also, and mentioned this in my comments earlier, rights at a household level versus individual rights is an issue that comes up time and again. Much of the world thinks in terms of collective rights as opposed to individual rights. And I think that's particularly complex when it comes to issues of women, persons with more severe types of disabilities, persons with, depending on the country and the region, certain types of disabilities. Often, I just was speaking to a woman who was a chair user a couple of weeks ago, living in a large extended household in a family in Zambia, and she said, "I know she was well educated. She said, I know my rights under the convention," she said, "but I don't want to press them because my family is very poor, and I feel that the priority in my family should be the children for not getting enough to eat." So where do we start with that? Well, there's lots of places to start. I'm not going to discuss it at length here, But I think that, again, we need to think of how Article 32 translates on the ground into complexities. Okay, there are additional complexity, rural versus urban, gender, ethnic, the type of disability one has, the severity of that disability, the age of onset of a disability will make individual choices different. Someone who loses their vision at birth is going to have a very different life course than someone who loses their vision at age 45, and we need to think of that. It's, again, it doesn't, in terms of a rights perspective, it makes no difference. One person is as entitled as another to all that the convention has to offer. But in terms of development and thinking through the complexity of development, we need to have a very thoughtful dialogue on how we as a global advocacy community are going to handle this. There are currently also a number of players. The UN system, for example, some of whom are suddenly on board. The World Health Organization a year and a half ago put out the World Report on Disability. 2-3 weeks ago, is it? The State of the World's Children, the annual report from UNICEF on something to do with children. This year, thanks to Rosangela Berman-Beeler and her crew at UNICEF, have for the first time featured disabled children. There's a new, get online and look at the State of the World's Children. It's kind of the most current thinking on the current data available on disabled children worldwide. These are important steps forward. There's also new development activity. AUSAID, the Australian government's funding of international development efforts. DFID, to a certain, the British, I was going to say UNAIDS, but I'm going to leave them off because they haven't done it much recently. USAID, I think it's supposed to be, USAID also. These organizations are starting to do a bit more on international development, and it's framed by the convention. Having said that, bilateral support goes up and down, so USAID used to do a lot. Currently, they're missing in action as far as I can tell. Is that fair to say, Janet? Yeah, we like them, but they're missing in action. AUSAID used to do nothing, now they're working more at it. So again, nothing stays fixed, but there are global trends and differences that you need to stay on top of if you're talking about Article 32 and who the players are who are responding to it, or should be responding to it. The big international aid organizations that are doing most of global development, again, things like Oxfam, Save the Children, you know the list, historically and currently are doing very little that could be considered really helpful for persons with disabilities. They have sometimes some programs, but in my experience, often when you press them on it, especially in light of the convention, what they say is our programs are universal. They reach everybody, but not persons with disabilities. What we need is more of what's called a twin track approach, where you have both inclusive programs and programs that are targeted at specific populations in need. And we don't have that. And I think we're letting a lot of these big organizations slide because nobody's showing up at their doorstep with a copy of the convention and saying, hi, we're your local DPO, and we'd like to go over the convention with you in detail. Oxfam or Save the Children, whatever. So those of you who are in any third world country where these organizations work, or any developed country where these organizations collect a lot of tax-free money, might want to just mosey on down to your local large international non-governmental organization with a copy of the convention and have a dialogue with them on what they're doing, especially in light of Article 32. Again, the DPO Civic Society, I've mentioned before, so I won't go over it here. So this is I've covered a lot of ground very quickly.
Thank you.
But what are the next steps? Well, I would say the next steps are that we need to realize that just because something's a law at the global level, or convention at the global level, doesn't mean that it translates into action on the ground. And there's an assumption that it does, and we have to start someplace. I'm not against international conventions, and I know that many of you have dedicated your lives to CRPD. So again, I think it's a terrific place to start. But just because it's on the books, even when it's been ratified by a national government, and even when the national government has come up with a national policy to match. So for the way that the convention works is that you ratify the convention, and either before or after that, depending on what countries. So, for example, Canada, I believe, has to change the laws before they approve a convention. Other countries do it afterwards. But you domesticate the convention by changing all your other laws to be in line with that overarching convention. And many countries have done this, and done this well. I know a few countries that have better policies on the books, for example, than Uganda. So there are many countries that have really excellent policies and really excellent laws and really excellent national guidelines. But unless they're enforced, it really is kind of an exercise in futility. They're there and we can work with them, and we should be working with them more. But when you get into someone, if you get into the office of the Minister of Education or the local district governor, and you trot out all this information, and the response is, well, yes, we know it's a law, but we have no money to implement it. We have more pressing issues in mind. What are you going to do about it? The United States would say, so sue me. Only in this case, if you sue them, there's almost, you can get a very small settlement, maybe 10 years down the road, if the legal system is working at all. Again, it's not as straightforward a process as one would think. So, to summarize, Article 32, it opens a can of worms in some ways. It puts us on the block by saying, while we're here with the convention, let's include all of international development. And by international development, I also include things like global health, so the overarching international development. And we'll get all these groups to talk to each other, produce data, we'll monitor and evaluate it, and make sure that it really translates into action on the ground. I would argue that in some ways Article 32 may be the most ambitious and least successful component currently of the convention. Having said that, it offers tremendous possibilities for advancement. We can pick it apart, we don't have to do it all in one go, but I think that it provides a framework that at least allows us as people who are working in global advocacy from a legal perspective to open a dialogue with many people at all levels in many countries, both developed and developing countries, where before the passage of the convention, we weren't entitled to have that dialogue. So in some ways, maybe I shouldn't say least successful. Let me put it more in an upbeat way. I think the Article 32 offers the most potential, unexplored potential, to really make a difference. But thus far, it's also been, we haven't explored that potential, and we need to understand that there are limitations, and very importantly, we need to understand that the entire global development community is coming at these issues in a completely different way than the global rights community. It's not that people in international development haven't thought of rights, and it's not that they don't think rights aren't important, but they do think that rights take a backseat oftentimes to a different mindset of the greatest good for the greatest number. And I see in the coming years a need to really develop a common dialogue between the two. Okay, now that I've cheered everybody up.
Thank you, Professor Groce.
Questions?
Yeah, we will have responses, but I think also I think we should have some questions as well. So if anybody has, I'm sure, questions from a very useful intervention. Now I'm really bad at pointing people out because my arms don't reach that far. So the person at the very back with the glasses, I'll be discussing defining characteristics as I'm pointing people out. Go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Robert. I used to work at the World Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization, and I loved your presentation. You hit a lot of nails on the head. I just have 2 questions. Number 1, post-Millennium Development Goal agenda, it's being, I don't know that much information about it because I don't know if it's still being drafted, if it's been launched, but when it comes to people with disabilities, do you know if there'll be updates on that or not? I'm not so sure. I tried to do a quick Google search, but I couldn't find anything. Number 2, this is going to get really misconstrued, so I'm going to try to ask in the most politically correct way as possible. But when I think of inclusive development, I think of cultural relativism in itself being a barrier. No? Okay, I just said it, but let me explain. Okay. You said there's a lot of stigma, such as HIV still being a taboo, disability still being seen as a shame, albinos being, off to the side. There's lots of examples. I can list many more. But when it comes to those issues, I don't want to be seen as the white guy in Africa blaming the victim or anything like that. But what, other than, including the twin track approach that you brought up earlier, that's really interesting. What other tactics can INGOs do in order to include people with disabilities? I think that's it.
Okay, I'm going to answer those 2 questions, and I'm also, because I have someone here doing her thesis on this, I'm going to turn it over to her as well. In terms of the MDGs, there's an ongoing dialogue right now. There's just been regional meetings all over the world among disability groups. I was just in one in Malaysia last a month ago. So there's some discussion starting to form, and there's policy papers. Sounds great. The MDGs themselves haven't quite gotten their act together yet, so the committees they're writing all these papers for haven't started yet. And so what the ultimate inclusion will be, I'm not sure. In the year 2000, when the MDGs first were written, the global disability community looked very different. Now, in the aftermath of all the work, mainly that came together around the convention, it's a very different frame of reference, and the global disability community is poised and waiting for the UN to get its act together to do something with the MDGs. Having said that, the MDGs are being rewritten now, and they have to have something in 2015. But they don't have to have something. It's possible that the UN has done this before. Everybody will gather around the table and there'll be no consensus. So we're assuming there'll be another set of the Millennium Development Goals. Mm-hmm. There may not be, and we should be thinking if there's no, if it falls apart like the Rio conferences fell apart, what's our fallback strategy if there's no MDGs? As far as cultural relativism goes, there's lots of ways to approach it. There are, as I said, we've done very little research on how different societies deal with disabilities in different ways. And this has been going on. I actually, years ago, this shows you how old I am, I did my thesis on, as an anthropologist, I stumbled across an island with a very high rate of hereditary deafness. And everybody on the island adapted by becoming bilingual in English and sign language. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. One place to start is to start by talking to the local people with disabilities and seeing what their take is on it and what they'd like to do about their lives and their own communities. We don't do that enough. We go in and we assume that we can speak on behalf of people who are disabled at the local level, but I think if we ask them more, then we might, we'd have at least some place to start. I could go on about cultural relativism, but as an anthropologist, you don't want to hear me go on for hours. But let me turn the floor over to Mary, who might have more to say, especially on the MDG.
Yeah, in terms of the process at the moment, the high-level panel have published their report in the past 2 weeks, and disability has been referenced in it. But that is only one part of the process. So there's a stock take meeting happening in New York now in September, which will be kind of bringing together the processes that have happened over the past couple of months. And then it will go into an open working group, which will work for another year, which will, and there's not even, I think, you know, there is kind of an understanding that what's happened up till now will translate into that, but there isn't any particular guarantee around that. So I think, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis and work put into consultations happening at country level for the past year. The high-level panel report is published, and so now it's still another year and a half of very strong advocacy work that needs to go on, and we're not even sure how open the process will be after September in comparison to what it's been up to now. So that's kind of where it's at the moment.
Yeah. To me, the MDG process, the actual who's in that building in New York coming up with it, is like a black box. It took me months to understand what was going on, and even then it was kind of squishy. So I'm the first to say I'm mystified about the MDG process itself, but it turns out that when I tried to find out what's going on from people who should know, they seem equally mystified. So I think that the term is stay tuned.
Anybody else got a question for Professor Groce? Yeah, gentleman here.
I would like to hear from you, particularly on the issue of how if one form of disability complementing the other form of disability. For example, particularly in developing countries like India, can be syndicates where deaf, blind and physically disabled and even sometimes intellectually disabled people coming together, syndicating and empowering themselves.
I'm sorry, could you just, so you mean syndicates where people with similar disabilities band together to support?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, historically there have been syndicates like that in many countries for many years. The syndicates, I think that it's an interesting approach to disability. One of the things that I'm interested in, and we don't know that much about, is how the syndicates have allied with DPOs. So
that's a problem because I feel that there is a lack of dialogue between the disabilities. For example, DPOs working for visually impaired have really little to offer when it comes to people with speech impairment. Like that. So there is a lack of dialogue between the different disabilities. So how to encourage the dialogue? And don't you think that encouraging that dialogue, particularly in the developing world, would be useful? You don't have many DPOs as well.
yeah, it depends on the country. So many countries do have those dialogues. They have national federations now. The Disabled People's International here, you know, that have put together some of that. There are in countries, so someone's here from Zambia, for example, they have ZAFA. Well, you know, there are some overarching organizations, but there's still many times where DPOs are put in, let me reframe that. I think part of the problem is not just there are competing interests, but often there's a very small pot of money, and people from outside the disability community are coming in and saying, well, we don't know who to give this to. Show us that your particular group is more disadvantaged or more at risk than somebody with a different kind of disability. And so we're continually putting DPOs in competition with each other for the same pieces of the pie, instead of saying, why isn't the pie larger? So I think that's part of the problem. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Groce. I think we will, Janet, maybe you would like to take the stage, as they say. I'll give a brief introduction. Janet is going to give a response. Janet is an international disability rights lawyer who's currently a senior research associate at the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. And Janet has a wide-ranging experience with regard to international development. She consults regularly with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNDP, I can list all the UN agencies here, and also with the bilateral donor agencies such as USAID. So Janet, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for the invitation to be on the panel. And I guess my response, I'll frame it in perhaps in terms of Nora's theme, which is the complexity of implementing Article 32. And I'll talk about that a little bit, both with respect to bottom-up or grassroots level implementation of Article 32, as well as the top-down challenges. And I'll start, I guess, with the top-down challenges. And a lot of the context for my work has been working on projects, disability-inclusive projects, funded by the United States government, particularly USAID and the State Department. So I'll talk a little bit about that and the challenges that I've encountered in that context. And I've worked both on disability-specific projects. I've done a lot of work around election assistance, various types of democracy and governance projects that are disability-specific in focus. But I've also worked on some larger development projects, or what we would call mainstream development projects, in which I was working on a disability component, attempting to contribute sort of a disability rights perspective. And both of those are challenging for various reasons. I do think that we have come a long way, because now disability inclusive development is actually on the agenda. It's part of the dialogue. We have a long way to go. I think the discussion around disability and development in the context of the treaty really did serve as an impetus for a number of donors to start thinking seriously either about developing some sort of disability policy or reforming the policy that it did have. So we are seeing some exciting developments, I think Mary, that are reflected in Mary's work, and she'll probably point to those. But I'll talk a little bit about USAID. They started out in 1997 with a disability policy paper that was non-binding, but its objective was to avoid discrimination against persons with disabilities in programs that USAID funds. And it aimed to promote the inclusion of people with disabilities in USAID programs and in host countries where USAID has programs. So that was a start. Not much happened. It wasn't really binding. In 2004, and notably that was sort of during the treaty process, USAID made that sort of policy guideline a formal policy with more specific objectives around non-discrimination and increasing awareness about disability issues in USAID programs, and supporting advocacy for persons with disabilities. So it had a little bit more heft, but still was a long way and really being effectively implemented. President Obama has moved the ball forward, I think, in appointing Charlotte McLean, who many of you may know, who is the disability policy coordinator now at USAID. And she is, and she's doing a lot within the agency. One of the things she's looking at doing is actually reforming even further the USAID disability policy. But I think she would be the first to say that there are just a number of tremendous challenges in implementing the policy at the top-down level. So actually informing mission directors at USAID about disability issues, making sure it's on their agenda, actually making sure USAID missions are accessible to persons with disabilities so that DPO leaders can actually engage in conversations and learn more about possible funding opportunities. So that in and of itself is a big challenge. Actually ensuring that persons with disabilities can apply for and be recruited and get jobs within USAID. We have improvements, but we still have all sorts of barriers to persons obtaining medical clearance to work on work for USAID and work for the State Department. I was involved in a research project funded by the National Council on Disability that looked at a number of these particular barriers. and they were pretty shocking. Some of them. There was one particular woman who had worked internationally for a number of different agencies, and she lived abroad in some pretty low infrastructure, post-conflict type environments, but when it came to the appointment, in the context of getting a job as a development officer in the U.S. government, living abroad in a country similar to the countries where she had already lived and worked, she couldn't get medical clearance. And they said, well, it would just be impossible for her to live in another country like that and to be able to work. And it took quite an effort for her to challenge that. So all sorts of issues and problems with regard to that. And Charlotte McLean is in the process of doing quite a lot of training to raise awareness about disability issues and what disability inclusion really means. Because it's one thing to have a policy, but translating that, as Nora said, into action on the ground, what does that mean in the context of a court administration reform project being funded across Indonesia? What does it mean in the context of an HIV and AIDS program, large-scale program to actually reach persons with disabilities and actually measure health outcomes? Well, there's things that you actually have to do. You can't just wish inclusion into a project. So we came up with a number of recommendations to USAID in order to, as a part of this National Council on Disability project, and I'll just go through a few of those recommendations to give you an idea of what came out of that research. One was to certainly enhance disability inclusion training in sessions for employees at USAID missions and embassies. Another was to review and update the disability policy. It's a bit outdated, and again, it doesn't really give implementers any kind of guidance as to what needs to happen to make inclusion actually work. As well as recommendations around issuing additional directives that require meaningful disability inclusion in statements of work and program descriptions. So if you have a multi-million-dollar project that aims to reform the police in a particular country, the statement of work and program description ought to, like a gender type lens or dimension, it ought to have a more of a specific disability dimension. It's not enough to say, oh, and this project should be inclusive of persons with disabilities. That's not going to give the responders to the proposals much help as to what to do. Charlotte McLean, I know, is working on applying a disability lens to the monitoring and evaluation effort so that we can actually enhance data collection so that when an implementer says, oh yes, our project aims to reach everyone, we're in fact knowing whether in fact it is reaching persons with disabilities. Other things that seem a little bit mundane but that are really important. So providing instructions for applicants for projects in the preparation of cost proposals for USAID on how to cost for reasonable accommodations and modifications for persons with disabilities in order to make a project accessible. So including a line item in the cost proposal for the costing of reasonable accommodation is actually really important. If you're wanting to, in the context of a civil society program, ensure that disabled people's organizations are included, you actually have to think about reasonable accommodation measures and making your meeting spaces accessible. But these are things that have not really been talked about. It's certainly not something that the big mainstream organizations doing development assistance think about at all. And I think the disability community has done, quite frankly, a very poor job of engaging with the mainstream development organizations on these kind of issues. Typically, disability organizations have not played much of a role in these large mainstream development programs, and hence there's very little understanding and capacity within those large organizations about particular strategies to reach persons with disabilities or strategies to make programs inclusive. So a lot of it's on us in the disability community to reach out and to make ourselves resources and experts for those organizations, because it's not going to happen without our advocacy. This is a big business. It's an industry, international development, and again, we can't just wish for inclusion, we actually have to make it happen. One of the areas where I'm not at all optimistic about is not so much USAID funding or State Department funding, but funding by the Department of Defense. We attempted to look into funding of development assistance programs by the Department of Defense, and it's a sort of impenetrable, very difficult to obtain any information, but we do know that DoD projects are funding inaccessible infrastructure in a lot of developing countries, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in other countries. So that is highly, highly problematic. So it's not just USAID or the State Department we typically think of as doing international development work. It's also the Department of Defense, and it's a whole variety of other federal agencies. So the complexity is really intense when you think about U.S. funding for international development and really what needs to happen across different agencies in order to make projects inclusive. And then thinking about what inclusion might mean or look like in practice, Nora referenced the work that she's done, and she's being way too modest, around inclusion in the context of HIV and AIDS programming. And she really did the path-breaking work, which was showing that the population of persons with disabilities was really being missed in the massively funded projects that were focusing on HIV/AIDS, education, testing, counseling, care and treatment. And the typology that Nora and her colleagues developed to actually address those gaps, I think is really useful and easily translatable to other projects. So looking at low-cost or no-cost solutions to make a particular HIV AIDS program accessible, just ensuring, for example, that HIV education projects at a community center are accessible, they're not held on the second floor, taking various action to reach out and train disabled persons in HIV education programs, not just reaching out to other civil society groups, women's groups, or child rights groups, but including disabled people's organizations. And then there's a sort of plethora of other types of responses that may be a little bit more costly or more long-term in nature, but I think that's a really useful way to think about it. We worked on a project in Zambia in which a very large mainstream HIV/AIDS program funded by the U.S. government was put in place, and we were able to hire a young disability advocate to work in that project as a disability focal point and expert, and he was very well connected to the disability coalition in the country, and they worked, I think, very successfully on ensuring that the educational projects, resources that were developed in the framework of the project took disability into account and appropriately characterized disability and not reinforcing negative stereotypes. Persons with disabilities were trained to go and do HIV/AIDS outreach within the framework of that project. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of working with disability organizations, disability advocates, to make sure that these development dollars are actually spent in a sensible and accessible way. I would say that Article 32 needs to be informed by the rest of the convention, because the convention provides a great template for ensuring that development is inclusive and in line with human rights. So unfortunately, one of the problems we still see around the world is donors funding the building of institutions or orphanages, or funders funding reform of mental health legislation or other disability legislation in ways that are not at all in keeping or consistent with the CRPD. So in terms of our discussions this week around legal capacity, independent living, institutionalization, both in terms of government donors, but even more so private donors are still reinforcing the bad practices that are now clearly in violation of the convention. So we have our work cut out for us in terms of educating donors as well as implementers of these development projects to think about what specific provisions of the convention should inform the way that they're doing their work on the ground, and I'm extremely concerned about how we're going to go about doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Janet? Anybody have any questions? Any comments? Okay. I'm going to slot myself in because I'm on the agenda to speak about this, so I have to chair myself now. But I'm going to be very short because I really want to hear what Yen Vo has to say, and I'm certainly not going to duplicate everything that Janet and Nora have both said. Just to give you a bit of a background with regard to my study, my PhD focused on Article 32 of the Convention, and it looked at mainstreaming disability in development aid, and it focused on 3 donor agencies. The Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Finland, USAID, and also AusAid. So I've just come to the very end, and I suppose I'm at the point of kind of hopefully submitting it this summer. But I just thought I'd share a few things, I suppose, that occurred to me, and that has come from the research for future thoughts around Article 32. And I suppose the first one was around the process of change. And I mean, we're all here speaking about kind of the process of change that the Convention has to bring. And one of the things that became very clear through the research was that this process of change has to come from within the country itself. There has to be ownership of it. And, I mean, most of the states have now ratified the Convention. But for many states who are operating within a development context, you're talking about little or no resources, possibly no political will, and also maybe no necessarily disability movement that is able to actually hold the state to account on this. But this really is, I suppose, in terms of, from what I saw from my research, one of the priority areas where the focus needs to be, which is looking at how development aid will never be tied, and you cannot tie development aid, but you can use development aid in a very useful way to build capacities of disabled people in developing countries. And there's one of the case studies I did in my research, which is the Disability Rights Fund. I don't know whether people here have heard of the Disability Rights Fund, but the Disability Rights Fund is a collaboration of donor agencies that have come together to look at how to provide and channel funding to DPOs who can then bring about change in their own countries. And one of the issues around that, and one of the issues that I saw through my research, was DPOs do not get funding. DPOs cannot compete against mainstream, as Janet has said, mainstream project implementers, because you're talking about huge structural agencies that are able to compete for billions of dollars, and disabled people's organisations will never be able to do that. So looking at the different mechanisms to channel funding that is not necessarily about services, and that's another, I think, important point that needs to be addressed within Article 32. We're talking about international development programmes, and we're talking about meeting the basic needs of people with disabilities, but we have to also go beyond that. And the Disability Rights Fund and different, I suppose, initiatives like that are looking at not funding service provision, but funding the grassroots local disability organisation to hold their state to account on the commitments they've made to the Convention. And I think that's actually quite a unique and a very positive process. Now, still, it's very small funding, and you can imagine if that was replicated on a much wider level, how much change it could possibly bring about. And it's not necessarily adversarial, I can never say the word, adversarial. It's also about how DPOs can work in partnership with their local governments, raising awareness on the Convention, and also working in terms of solving the issues that they face. So that's kind of one aspect. So I think it really is about the process. Change has to come within the country itself, and development aid has a role to play within that. I think the reality is at the moment is development aid is shrinking. The OECD, the DAC report, Development Assistance Committee reports have showed consistently over the past number of years that development aid from the major Western donors is decreasing due to austerity and to different kind of, I suppose, fiscal expenditure in donor countries. So the possibilities of leveraging equal opportunities for people with disabilities just through financial assistance is reducing. And I think that's something, in terms of future, how we think about that. And it's back to the state. It's back to state cooperation. And as Nora spoke about, Article 32, during its negotiations, even though it was quite contentious around, the responsibility of where the implementation of the convention lies, one of the consensus that did come from it was that there is and there needs to be state-to-state cooperation, and that is north to north, north-south, and very, two-way streets, not necessarily just from one perspective. So I think that's something we need to really think about in terms of Article 32, that, focusing really narrowly around development aid, is not going to bring disability into wider foreign policy, international cooperation issues. With regard to, Janet spoke about USAID and spoke about kind of the processes that go on internally within the agencies to include people with disabilities. And I think one of the things, and this is not just unique to disability, this is, has come through gender mainstreaming, is we can no longer have business as usual with regard to mainstreaming. Mainstreaming and the way it works has to change. And the criticisms around gender mainstreaming and development very much focused around the fact it didn't give a voice to the people it was representing or purporting to bring about change, and also it didn't recognise diversity. And if we don't learn from those lessons, we're going to continually respond to disability issues within a siloed category of disability. We're not going to see the intersectionality of our disability, women with disabilities, children with disabilities, Indigenous people with disabilities, people with HIV/AIDS. This is about moving disability into a much broader understanding of how discrimination happens, and particularly in a development context, because that can be quite different to the context that we have here. So in terms of mainstream, there needs to be, I suppose, a reconfiguration of that with regard to, I don't think we can adopt what has been, to date around gender mainstreaming. We need to learn from that. I think we spoke a lot today. I've heard a lot about DPOs and disability organisations, and I've been a disability advocate for many years, and I've worked in the Irish movement and also the international movement. And I think there is something about the disability movement needing to start talking the language of development. And I think Nora spoke about it there, the dichotomy between human rights and development. If the disability community doesn't start talking about development and having an input into development, we need to be able to be at the table to do that. So whether that's at the post-2015, whether that's at the PRSPs, whether that's at developing poverty, anti-poverty action plans, we need to be there. We haven't been there till date. There's been efforts at it, but there needs to now in terms of capacity building, about holding states accountable for human rights. We also need to look at the models of development that's happening and have our say in that and have our commentary about political economies and learn from, I suppose, the different other groups that have worked in this area, that we can't just keep within our own, I suppose, kind of specific disability rights aspect. Then lastly, I think was the last point I had, I think, two things. First of all, we have to realise development aid is hugely political. Hugely political. So I just don't think we can be very kind of naive about that, and I think we have to realise it's hugely political. And as disability advocates and as people working in that area, we need to understand that, and we need to understand how to navigate the political aspects of it, because aid is political. So we really need to start thinking about it, and I don't think we've been thinking about it to date with respect to that. I think lastly, we're all here talking about the negative side of things. The future, could be bright. I hope it could be bright. I think one of the things is, again, the criticism around mainstreaming is diversity. If the disability community and if disability advocates are not framing disability within an inequality, human rights perspective, we will be left out from negotiations, and we will be left out from discussions. So we have to learn to talk about our issues in a much wider framework, because that is where the trends are going now. The trends are going towards the wider overarching issues of inequality. You'll see that through the high-level panel, you'll see that through all of the consultations that have happened around post-2015. And if we're not bringing ourselves into that, and I think that's a real role Article 32 can do in terms of international cooperation, is looking at how to position disability within that broader policy discussion, and not just becoming an article which is about proofing how aid is spent around disability, because I think that's a narrow approach that we could take with it. So that's kind of just my take on Article 32. I'm going to hand over to Yen. Unless anybody has any specific questions, I'm going to hand over to Yen, because I know Yen has a lot to tell us from a Vietnamese perspective, and we have about 15 minutes, Yen. Is that okay? Yeah.
Maybe a little more.
Maybe a little, we'll see. 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you.
I've been here for several days, and I learned a lot from the presentation and the sharing of the speakers. And I see our situations on the presentation, especially from the presentation of Elizabeth from Kenya, and also the sharing from some participants from Mozambique. And also I remember that from the first day, Professor Quinn stressed that the convention is a powerful tool, but it itself does not bring about change. We do. And how can people with disabilities participate in the whole process, especially people with disabilities from the countries with rare resource and disabilities not considered among the priorities like our countries. And I want to share with you some information about disability in Vietnam and our work in Vietnam, and also the importance of international cooperation to our effort. So, as I said from the beginning, that Vietnam now have around 13 million people with disabilities, and 40% cannot know how to read and write, and only 17% graduated from high school, and less than 0.1% can go to college or university, and only 30% can have some unstable jobs. The others have to rely on their family members or some religious organization for their living. And also in Vietnam, we recently have the disability law based on some concept from the convention. But you see that we see that most of the government agencies and also other development projects, they still based on the charity model. Not medical model, but still charity model. And we have we found that National Coordinating Council on Disabilities. But it's very quick because it is under the department within the Ministry of Social Affairs. So they're not in the strong position to coordinate all the different ministries and organizations on disability issues in Vietnam. We also have the Disability Federation on Disabilities, but it's similar to the Chinese Federation sharing by Victoria Lee early that it's not the real representative of people with disabilities in our country. And based on that, I started my organization 7 years ago, and our main goal is to raise awareness on disability issues in Vietnam, not only for the public members, but also for people with disability themselves, so that they can realize their values and capacity, their ability. And also we try to provide all the information related to law or policy related to disability, so that they can know their rights. But knowing rights not enough. So we have another goal to help them to build capacity, so that they can be the strong leaders or something to realize their rights. And we focus on two directions. We help people with disabilities to empower themselves, and we use successful cases to do the media advocacy. We cooperate with the media so that we can convey our message to the public members, and to the media we convey our message to the government. And after 7 years, my organization is considered as the leading organization in Vietnam on disability field, and I recently consider my organization as a partner on disability field in Vietnam. And to fulfill these objectives and have these achievements, we cannot do that without the funding from different international organizations. Like for the start of my organization, we get the grant from Prof Foundation, and then after 4 years, we consider as the best grantee that Prof Foundation has ever had in Vietnam. And after that, we get another funding from Nippon Foundation from Japan for our pilot project on independent living, so that we can help people with severe disabilities, and we promote independent living service in Vietnam. And also we get the funding from IRIS-Ed for our inclusive employment projects. Also another small grant from OSF for some training for parents, children with autism and developmental disabilities. And another grant from Atlantic Philanthropy with the Youth Empowerment Project, so that we can recruit the potential leaders and help them to become the strong leaders in the future. So kind of, we not ratify the convention, but our organization's efforts in preparing the future leaders for the implementation of the convention later. And I have to say that the capacity that many speakers mentioned is very important in Vietnam and for people with disabilities in Vietnam. So I appreciate all the opportunity like this, so that I can learn from your experience. I can increase my knowledge on the disability field, and also the scholarship from like OSAD or IRIS-Ed or from for foundation that give the opportunity for the youth with disabilities in my country, so that they can become the future expert on disabilities. And that's all what I want to share, but I have the clips here I want to share with you so that you can see all the challenge faced by people with disabilities in my country, and also what we are doing in Vietnam. So can you please? And sorry that we have some captions. So I see that here we have some participants with visual impairment. So can the person next to that person have to read the caption? Just very short. So the person next to the participant with visual impairment, please read the caption for them. Thank you.
Chứ thật ra ngày xưa em sống với ba mẹ, chứ ông bà ngoại nghĩ là mình khuyết tật mình không có đi đâu đâu, nên là không có giấy tờ. Tới lúc mà bước chân lên thành phố rồi lúc đó mới đi làm giấy tờ. Giấy tạm giác được chút gì cũng có, giống như là mình đang sống vào dòng pháp luật vậy. Giống như là gia đình em chỉ có biết là có 2 người con thôi, không biết em là người thứ 3. Hàng xóm ở gần đó giờ nào quen lắm sao không biết luôn. Tại suốt ngày đâu có ra ngoài đâu nên ta đâu biết.
Em vịn cái chân, cái tay này vịn chân này vịn nhé, là em đi. Hồi đó cũng cái anh ở xóm là nói em là bò lết ở dưới đất đó, giờ không có làm được. Do đó là chặt cái đi câu sấu. Ở dưới quê em có câu là cái gì bỏ đi thì chặt ra để câu cá sấu. Đó nghĩa là bỏ là không còn sử dụng được nữa, nên là chặt câu sấu. Bởi anh mới nói là què lớp như thế rồi không có làm được gì đâu, chặt ra câu sấu còn sướng hơn. Có con cá sấu còn sướng hơn là có ăn. Cá sấu bán có tiền nữa.
At the age of 3, nor the obstacles of growing up with a disability in Vietnam could keep her down. Unlike most people with disabilities, Ian finished school got a master's degree abroad, and when she was told that she was still not fit for work, she set out on her own path. "I think with my head, not with my legs," she cried. Since that day, Ian has been at the forefront of the human rights movement for people with disabilities in Vietnam. Providing social services for people with disabilities is not a gift. It's their right. It's the law. In 2005, Ian opened DRD, Center for Disabilities Research and Development. But she had a very different idea about people with disabilities than other associations.
Some sounds missing.
Sound missing.
Và đầu tiên là sẽ mời nhóm My Future. Các em sẽ có một học
Tính thì lên trên đây thì thấy nó rộng lớn, thấy mình giống như là mình rơi vào một thế giới khác.
Trước kia em rất là rụt rè trong cuộc sống, em ít tiếp xúc với mọi người.
Có các chị cùng hoàn cảnh với mình nên là chia sẻ những cái kinh nghiệm nào mà các chị đã từng ở dưới quê, đã cũng từng có người giống như hoàn cảnh mình, thì ta chia sẻ động viên an ủi thì mình càng thấy nó gần hơn nữa.
Thì từ hồi tham gia đi tới giờ là em có lửa hơn rất là nhiều.
Today, DRD has over 500 beneficiaries and welcomes new people all the time.
I'm missing the
The sound again. I don't think it's...
When you put it stereo, I think that is mono. So
I can't do anything about that. It's the video.
It's the video, I think. It's not.
So this is just the introduction of our activities. We provide the scholarship, employment service, and also independent living service for people with severe disabilities at the pilot project. And also
Giống như là ở chương trình đi có tập huấn, có một cái cuộc tập huấn nói yes với tất cả mọi thứ. Say yes có nghĩa là cái gì mình nghĩ được, người khác làm được.
The most difficult thing for people with disabilities is getting around. Very few places or means of transport are accessible to them. So members of DRD are redesigning the city the way they see fit.
So we organize the accessible campaign in Ho Chi Minh City, and that motivate a lot of youth with disabilities, and also we order students from different universities join the campaign, and then become the youth ambassador for our effort. And also based on the campaign, we do the awareness raising, and also we attract the attention of the public members.
So lower down. Yeah. Okay, stop. We can lower down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Before leaving, each participant puts his or her idea of a better life on the dream tree.
It's okay. Yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
And this is the result of the campaign. The youth, they gather together and they raise the dream. They said that is their dream about the accessible city, accessible society. And also we have the clubhouse. We call that life is beautiful. That is something like, as Professor Wen Wei mentioned from the first day, that very easy that people with disability are taken use by the media as the helpless image or something. So that's why we call our clubhouse Life is Beautiful. And if they come to our clubhouse, they can see that people with disability can have joy, they can enjoy life, and they can laugh and can share their experience with others. And we have the clubhouse here where we call that the transitional phase, that people with disability can come to work with each other, and they build a network with different NGO, local NGO working on children, on women, and also other social workers, and also famous actors, actresses, or singers that can come to our clubhouse to share with people with disabilities. And based on the clubhouse and other activities, we do the awareness. And right now we consider as the strong advocate on disabilities in Vietnam. And whenever the media they want the input for some disability-related project, they come to my organization to ask for our opinion on that. And I can say that we cannot achieve this without the international funding, because we get nothing from the government. But it's also create the risk on sustainability, because right now we successfully established the network of more than 35 disabled people organizations in the south of Vietnam, a kind of the real voice of people with disabilities. But we face the risk to sustain the activities of this network, because like the Prof Foundation, they closed their office and programs in Vietnam, and they the main funders for our network. And right now we do not have the funding for this the network and also the other projects, because Vietnam now announced that we become the average income country, and more donors withdraw from Vietnam, while the government is not ready to support the local NGO like my organization. And also the business people in Vietnam, they still have the kind of the charitable actions to help people with disabilities, not like the social responsibility to consider the organization like my organization as the partner to their community project. So we face the risk of to sustain our activities. And thank you for listening.